My name is Claire, and I'm an event manager here at Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Elliott Bay Books, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our presentation with Nora Kenworthy and Marcus Harrison Green. Kenworthy's new book, Crowded Out, is the subject of tonight's talk. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are so glad to have you join us tonight for our 25th anniversary season. The presentation will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. When we get to the Q&A portion of the event, you may ask your question through this microphone right here to my right, or you can use your smartphone to scan the QR code on the screen to submit your question digitally. We'll drop the link in the chat as well for our people watching on the live stream, and you can submit a question at any time. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and you can help us by keeping your own question concise. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by the True Brown Foundation. Town Hall is also a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of the members who are joining us tonight. If you share Town Hall's vision of a community strengthened by discussions about civics, science, and culture where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us by donating or becoming a member. Lastly, you'll absolutely want to dig into tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of the author's book. Please pick up your copy through Elliott Bay Books at the Auto Bar. We've also got Marcus's latest book for sale as well. Nora Kenworthy is an associate professor at the University of Washington, Bothell. She's the author and editor of several books, and her writing has appeared in the American Journal of Public Health, Social Science and Medicine, PLOS One, Scientific American, The Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Marcus Harrison Green is a columnist for the Seattle Times. A longtime Seattle native, he's the founder of the South Seattle Emerald, which focuses on telling the stories of South Seattle and its residents. We are also joined tonight by Hinton Publishing, where Marcus is a publisher. And we've got an event coming up on June 1st with Reagan Jackson, and we've actually got that book for sale over there right now. So if you want to go to that, grab your book and you can read ahead. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Nora Kenworthy and Marcus Harrison Green.
Thank you all for being here. It's so lovely to be here in conversation.
Are you sure your mic is on?
Can you hear me now? Okay. I really appreciate everyone being here, particularly at the tail end of a busy academic year and on a school night. It's really an honor to be here at Town Hall, which is truly one of my most beloved places in Seattle, and also to share the stage here with Marcus Harrison Green, who's such a deeply thoughtful and intellectually generous person. So thank you all for making this evening possible. I think our plan is that I'm going to offer a couple brief remarks about the book, just to kind of ground our conversation, and then Marcus and I will have a much more informal and hopefully fun conversation about the book, and what lessons it offers for how we might more equitably cultivate care, support, and health in our communities. And then we'll turn it over to you for questions. So like all good book projects, this one began with a puzzle that I couldn't figure out and a problem that I couldn't look away from. I'm going to show you a little bit what crowdfunding campaigns looked like when I began. So this was about 10 years ago, and when I started finding crowdfunding campaigns both on the internet and on street corners in real life in Seattle. And at the time, I was driving friends and family crazy, talking about this website that no one had heard of, called GoFundMe, and trying to explain what was happening there, and why so many campaigns that I found there were for medical needs and health expenses. But then this phenomenon just kept growing. It kept getting more and more popular. By 2019, a quarter of Americans had started or donated to a campaign specifically for medical expenses in the US. GoFundMe became an eponym for what we do in crisis. You should start a GoFundMe. We're going to need a GoFundMe. Sometimes it seems like we can trace America's moments of crisis, trauma, hate, and hope by hopscotching from one viral campaign to the next. So I was really inspired to write this book by conversations with neighbors, friends, family, and my own students about what was happening here. The book responds to a series of implicit questions about crowdfunding that I heard from many of you in these conversations. So why is crowdfunding so popular? What do people find there? Who succeeds and who does not? And how is crowdfunding changing the way that we give and receive help in the US? What I and other researchers found as we did this research was that crowdfunding was not the feel-good, strangers helping strangers story that it was often portrayed to be. Multiple studies documented facts like 90% of medical campaigns were not meeting their goals. 30 to 40% of campaigns got no donations whatsoever. And this so-called marketplace was one where racial, gender, socioeconomic, class, and other disparities were rampant. And so crowdfunding was becoming something that was actually exacerbating and worsening the very social inequities and health system gaps that caused people to turn to it in the first place. And more broadly, it was changing how people thought about rights, entitlements, deservingness, and care within health and social political systems. So most casual observers of crowdfunding, I think, notice some of these things implicitly, even if they don't see them explicitly. So we look at campaigns like this one and we think, yeah, I guess it's heartwarming that someone might get help with their insulin, but really, like, is this what we're reduced to? This is what we have to do to get care. This is how we're making choices about who gets care. And so I wanted the book to give readers a conceptual vocabulary for naming this discomfort, to help us identify what is going on in these visceral moral reactions to crowdfunding. And so I developed the idea of moral toxicities, something that sort of suffuses the crowdfunding realm and also our broader social systems that drive people to crowdfunding and force them to be reliant on it. So these moral toxicities, from ideas about the deserving poor and selective deservingness to false meritocracies and downstream tech solutionism, help to explain crowdfunding's impacts not just on people's access to care, but on our social worlds. And I call these moral toxicities because I believe, like other toxins, they suffuse our environments. They're in the air that we breathe. And they tend to accumulate in our bodies and, as importantly, in communities that are already marginalized. So I'm offering this book as a sort of public offering of lessons that I've learned from my own and others' work on medical crowdfunding over the course of a decade. It also summarizes insights from many different projects, many of them collaborative, and carried out in partnership with other faculty, with students across many disciplines. And so I want to express my deep gratitude to collaborators, including Mark Igra, Jinkyu Jung, who's here, Lauren Berliner, Aaron Davis, Emily Hobbs, many others. This book is only one version. It's my version of what I think crowdfunding means in our contemporary world, and I bear the mistakes and omissions on my own. But this work would have been far harder to do and far more lonely and boring without these really rich and fruitful partnerships with so many valued colleagues and students. And of course, this book was made possible through deep networks of care. From family and friends and coworkers and care workers and others who offered me time and support and resources to do this work. And so I want to offer my thanks to all who fall into those many categories. So as we moved along with this research, the one thing that we realized was really missing from earlier projects was an opportunity to tell the story of actual crowdfunders and what they were finding when they started crowdfunding. To really explore in their own words, in the depth that those stories were owed. And it was through conversations with crowdfunders who truly awed me time and time again with their honesty, their insights, their harrowing journeys through the US healthcare system that really convinced me that I had a book to write on this topic. And as I was writing that book, I was constantly thinking of the words of Arundhati Roy, who in The God of Small Things reminds us of how difficult and important it is to care for the stories of other people. She writes, "It is, after all, so easy to shatter a story, to break a chain of thought, to ruin a fragment of a dream being carried around carefully like a piece of porcelain. To let it be, to travel with it, is much the harder thing to do. The stories we so often see on crowdfunding sites are constructed, a version crafted for public audiences, for appeal, for spread across platforms. And oftentimes those platforms and those crowds that encounter those stories often treat them with a great deal of carelessness. And so my approach was really trying to restore some of the care to those stories that I wanted people to be entitled to as they were putting them forth in the world. But just as there is no single crowdfunding story, there is no simple solution to the challenges that crowdfunding presents us. Stories of crowdfunding experiences are stories about technology, society, health, and the complex interweaving between these systems in our contemporary lives. And in Crowded Out, I try and follow, rather than unravel, these interwoven threads to better understand how they work together to fuel health inequities. And ultimately, this book is an invitation to look beneath the surface of seemingly feel-good technologies that have become an indelible part of our public and private lives, to reflect on what role we want them to play in our societies, and to imagine future alternatives for what care, connection, and solidarity could become. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Marcus.
Thank you. So Nora, again, thank you for having me today to be in conversation with you. Just reading through this book, on the surface, it's about the rise in crowdfunding and what that has meant, but I mean, it's about so much more, as you point out. There are multiple collisions of everything from racism to neoliberalism to the failure of late-stage capitalism. And so I want to actually read a portion from the book that I think is a great summation of what you were trying to tackle in this book, and it's actually, I guess you could say, a poem or flash nonfiction portion that you open up the meat of the book with, and it's called Shame, or The Sham, excuse me. Extra, extra, read all about it. I need a bunch and wish it wasn't that much. Obamacare, Trumpcare, Medicare, everybody tells us we need it. But I can't afford health insurance, let alone COBRA. It's a no for Obamacare because I earn too little. I applied for care credit cards, but even they denied me. When the cancer got to stage 4 and she lost her job, we paid for COBRA until it ran out. If we can just raise $60,000, maybe $80,000, we can keep her alive long enough to get a transplant and Obamacare. The basis of the American economy is a sham. And what I mean by this is, unless you make $50,000 to $60,000 a year, you can't afford health insurance, even with Obamacare. What's unaffordable about the Affordable Care Act are the deductibles, the out-of-pockets, the premiums. We pay $500 a month for her insurance. But the doctors in the ER just laughed and said, nobody takes your insurance. I wish my battle had only been with cancer, but it's mostly been with bureaucracies, insurance companies, Obamacare loopholes. With each battle, the cancer keeps spreading. And I opened with that, not only because you opened the book with that, but I mean, that is why so many people, feel that they have to essentially objectify themselves on a crowdfunding platform in order to get care. And when I talked to you prior to today, about what we would talk about tonight, you said you wanted to make sure that folks knew that you weren't trying to shame people for their decisions and so forth. It isn't that somebody has to go on GoFundMe and ask for $20 donations for insulin. It's just the fact that that circumstance exists at all. And so I want to start by asking you, what stops us as collectively as a nation from asking why people have to do this in the first place?
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for reading that poem. So the book does have some poems throughout it, and I've created them out of snippets of text from actual GoFundMe campaigns. And so what I'm trying to do there is sort of cultivate this kind of chorus of voices that I often encountered while doing the research, and that kind of haunted my head for 10 years. And I've often told people that it's very common to encounter the phrase, "we have nowhere else to turn," or "this is our last option." It's probably the most common phrase that I see in crowdfunding campaigns. And it really speaks to me about the place that a lot of people are at when they turn to crowdfunding. It's often not just about letting family know that you're sick or getting some neighbors to start pulling for you, but it's really an act of very severe desperation, because our healthcare system is so expensive, particularly in moments of catastrophe, and because so many Americans cannot afford even the small catastrophes of our healthcare system. So oftentimes people are coming to these platforms with very large needs and finding some help sometimes, but often very little help. And so one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that crowdfunding thrives in places where healthcare is highly marketized and where patients and their families and their communities are carrying the bulk majority of the healthcare costs of that system. You know, we have a lot of conditions in the US that drive people to become even more economically fragile as they get sick. So it's very common to see crowdfunding campaigns for someone who's gotten cancer and then is no longer able to work because of the cancer treatments, and then they're on COBRA, and then they lose their insurance, and then they're waiting to get on public insurance, and meanwhile, they just truly can't actually pay for the cost of their care. And so for me, I think GoFundMe provides this bizarre, deeply intimate window into people's lives at these crucial moments, and how they're trying to navigate a system that is really stacked against them.
Yeah, you brought up earlier about what you call the financial and moral toxicities, right? That sort of keep us from potentially having a more collectivized vision of our healthcare system. And one of the themes, though, that emerges through your book and when you're talking to various people is what I would call sort of a narrative toxicity, in the sense of, so many people, even who are in dire need, believe in this bootstraps nature, or this, rugged individualism that keeps them sometimes from, even when they're on GoFundMe, keeps them from asking for what they actually need. And then you write that's also sort of the same thing that stops us from actually having more collectivized, right, versions of medical care, such as potentially universal health care. Can you talk a little bit more about how, I'll just say, the American dream is kind of killing us?
The American dream is definitely killing us. We have a really long and dirty history in the United States, as I'm sure many of you are aware, of blaming people who are most in need of care. And most in need of charity. And the ways that we do that are through racism, first of all, and also racial capitalism. And in particular, we come up with these narratives, these stories, these moral stories, the deserving poor, right? Or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, or trickle-down economics. And these become narratives that justify our exclusion and exploitation of marginalized communities from systems of care that they deserve and that they're entitled to. And what I became interested in this book was the way that crowdfunding marketplaces were reifying and amplifying those same moral values and drilling them down into our social media feeds and into our very individual decisions of who we were going to support. So you see a lot of the same patterns playing out in crowdfunding campaigns. So-and-so is a hardworking father. He's the sole breadwinner of the family. We hate that we're here. We feel so much shame about asking for help. We'd never be those people, but we have nowhere else to turn. I mean, that's the classic GoFundMe narrative. And what that, to me, amplifies is a set of moral norms that are the polar opposite of what we would want if we were actually fighting for a more just healthcare system, a healthcare system where people recognize that everyone is equally deserving of some modicum of care, right? That it's not up to us to decide who gets care based on the color of their skin or how popular they are on Twitter. And so I wanted to kind of push us a bit to recognize how this thing that had become so popular and sort of mindless for us in terms of crowdfunding was actually further normalizing for us the very things that were undermining our impetus for more just healthcare systems.
Can you talk a little bit more about you in the book you talk about, and I hadn't read this before until obviously reading your book, just because you're so brilliant and you made it up, but it's called we've moved in some ways from the deserving poor to the deserving popular.
Yeah.
And you talk about doing a anonymized study where you had on one hand, I want to say this is a white person from a fairly well-to-do family who had a wonderful photo, and this nice heartbreaking story, but honestly didn't really need the money all that much, versus somebody who was literally in their deathbed, nearly near death, and because they couldn't give some eloquent soliloquy about why they needed the money, they weren't able to meet their funds and to meet their goals. And it reminded me of that old Chris Rock joke that, like, when I'm poor and hungry, I don't have time to be clever, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the things that I did in this research was actually pull together focus groups to look at anonymized campaigns. So we basically would take a real campaign and then kind of strip the identifiers and show people these different campaigns and ask them, can you talk us through how you're thinking about this, how you're reading it? One of the primary comparisons that I asked people to do was between this fairly well-off white woman who was a nurse who had health insurance, who had cancer, and this disabled single dad whose son was also disabled, who was in hospital and was saying that if he didn't get rent money by Friday, they were going to be homeless. And he was worried about how his son was going to survive living in his car because his son relied on some complex medical equipment. And when I set this up, I was like, this is obvious, right? We're going to pick B, right? Like, we get that we're supposed to pick B, and people didn't pick B. And even though a lot of people in these focus groups were very well-meaning people who gave a lot to their communities, they were very able to construct stories for why they were not picking the more needy case. And that included spelling errors. It included blaming this father for not having thought ahead about needing rent money. It included critiquing the quality of the photo on the campaign page. And so I'm interested in what this normalizes for us of how we read each other's need, right? And one of the other stories that I tell in the book is of a very, very popular campaign for some media personalities. It obviously went very well. People did great. But after it was done, I talked to the organizers, and they said, well, the reason this campaign did so well is because, so-and-so, this person that the campaign was for, well, he's just a really good person. And I tried to kind of push. I was like, yeah, but you're like media producers, and you have like tens of thousands of followers on Twitter, and like, no, he's just a really good person. And when you're a good person like that, that becomes your form of insurance. And so I began to observe the way that very popular campaigns were equating success with goodness, right? This like moral goodness. And I think that's really even kind of further pushing this very problematic relationship that we already have in America between like deservingness and wealth and privilege and all the other privileges.
How much of that, to your point, how much of that is just, a reflection of what our society is right now, right? I was on King 5 the other day talking about the 4th anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and one of the points of data that was brought up was that only I want to say that 70% of white people have exclusively white social circles, right? And so it's not necessarily, well, nobody here, I know you're in the 30% who have black friends, so anyway, but I mean, the point was, right, that it's very harder to like have a level of empathy for folks that matches every single person that you meet. And so when it comes to things like crowdfunding, knowing that society is what it is in terms of socioeconomically, that on average, right, Black people, specifically Black
Yes.
women, are going to have, less affluence, less wealth than their white counterparts, and yet I want to say that I believe the data that you pointed to in the book, like 5%, less than 5% of Black women are actually successful in terms of getting funding on these crowdfunding sources.
Yeah, so I think it's two intertwined phenomenon that are happening. So the first thing to know is that the vast majority of crowdfunding campaigns do not go viral, and they mostly travel through networks of known family and friends. And plenty of social research has shown how our networks are people like us, right? So birds of a feather, the whole thing. And so when a fairly wealthy, well-educated white person sets up a crowdfunding campaign, that campaign is going to go to a lot of people in their network, and it's probably going to do quite a bit better than a campaign that's moving through a much more impoverished network. And given the enormous racial wealth gaps that we have in the US, it's pretty easy to tie those racial wealth gaps to outcomes in crowdfunding campaigns. So even though a campaign can be shared more in, for example, a low-income Black social network, it's going to earn less a lot of the time. The second thing, though, is outright bias and discrimination. And that happens especially as campaigns become more public and more viral. So we also did a study of looking at the most viral medical campaigns. So every medical campaign that had raised over $100,000, and we found about 850 of them. 5 of them were for Black women, and 2 of those were created by white people. And what we saw, even with that tiny, tiny proportion, was a lot of rampant sort of racialized judgment from donors and in the comments. And so we really did see a lot of evidence of those more overt forms of racial bias also playing out as campaigns pick up traction, and also as they move across all these other social media spaces that we know can be really oftentimes racially hostile, right, as well as biased.
Yeah, I guess sticking on that point, you bring this up in the book, and then obviously we just had, as I mentioned, the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. You talked about how after his murder in 2020, there was this barrage of crowdfunding and donations that were going to Black folks from their white friends, or from people who I guess wanted to, in some ways, assuage their guilt. It almost felt like, I was talking to my girlfriend Danielle about this, it almost felt like the alms or indulgences, right, that clergy would be paid for allowing people's sins to be washed away, so to speak. And so I'm just curious, why did it seem that folks were willing to do that and sort of have their hands washed, and not sort of want to sustain that energy around things that could actually sort of transform our our social hierarchy?
That's the key question, right? So I sort of retell the story told by Emmanuel Dezozzi about this bizarre phenomenon of people PayPaling their friends money in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd murder and everything else. And
I'm Image Green 3000 if y'all want to give anything tonight.
We got a QR code for and I thought he had a great line for it. He called it here's $5, sorry for racism. And I think there's a way in which our social media enabled economy has really trained people into doing 2 things. The first is, and this is an idea that comes from Lana Schwartz, is the idea that increasingly our membership and our participation in online communities is facilitated by the transfer of cash and the transfer of small amounts of money through those communities. And that used to not be the case, right? But now a lot of how we participate in those communities happens through transfers of money, small transfers of money. And then the second thing is that we've become very accustomed to doing these small gestures online in order to solve the problem, right? And I think it gives us a sense of false agency. So I talked to a lot of people in the wake of the Uvalde school shooting who had been giving to crowdfunding campaigns, and we talked about the deep and profound hurt that they felt about this school shooting and how tragic they thought it was, and just how like connected they felt to these families. And then they talked about donating to crowdfunding campaigns as like the only thing that they could do. It was the only thing that they could think to do to assuage that deep hurt. And I think it, as GoFundMe's own CEO has said, this has become the internet's take action button. And I think that has trained us against a lot of other kinds of taking action. I mean, I can't think of a better example than a crowdfunding campaign for a school shooting victim of something that like is not gonna fix the problem at its source, right? You are very much solving the downstream problem, and nothing that you're doing there is necessarily going to stop the next school shooting.
Well, speaking of the CEO of GoFundMe, he said that he doesn't actually want the platform to be used for things like this, right? And like for medical expenses, he wants it to be used for honeymoons. You're trying to raise money for that, or like taking the soccer team to wherever. Yes. And yet the reality is, right? I mean, he is profiting off of people's pain, right? I think you're right. That, like, they're in a growth industry, people's pain, right? So how in the world are they able to square, his sort of ideals with the reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think GoFundMe and also other platforms are in a tough position. They claim, at least, and I've talked to founders of some of these platforms, they claim that they didn't develop platforms for this purpose. They really thought, like, we're gonna raise money for my kid's soccer team. And then they kind of turned the lights on, and the next thing they knew, it was just houses that burned down and people with cancer, and they just kind of were like, whoa. And as one founder told me, he was like, all this was out there in the market latent, and we didn't know until we turned it on what was out there and how it was going to be used. But I think there's a PR problem for GoFundMe that they're constantly running up against, which is like, be depressing enough to like get people to donate to you, but don't be so depressing that you ruin our brand, right? And I think that's kind of part of what they're trying to get at here. And so they'll say things like, Congress, we can't do your job for you. We need you to pass pandemic assistance bills. But at the same time, they are constantly profiting from those circumstances. So regardless of how well a campaign does or what circumstances are causing it to happen in the first place, GoFundMe is poised to make money.
Wow. Well, where do I go from here?
I'm a ray of sunshine. We can just keep going.
Well, on that note, you do talk about, though, ultimately that this is all just a function of neoliberalism, which, to be reductionary, right, is just that everything, nothing is a public good. Like, everything needs to filter through a market mechanism. And so, can you just talk a little bit more about why that strand of thought that is, from Ronald Reagan to Margaret Thatcher, who you say they used to call Tina, meaning there is no alternative to a neoliberal system, how that has unfortunately, ended us to where we are, or gotten us to where we are today.
Yeah, I think it's gotten us to where we are today, and it's also impeded our ability to imagine and create other ways of coming into community together and building the kinds of worlds that we want to see and the kinds of health systems that we want to see. So if it's okay if I just actually read that section really quickly.
Please.
I promise it's not long, but I think I wrote it better than I'm going to say it. So in the book, I talk about how we live in what I call the meanwhile. So what do we do as we're waiting for these better systems to be made, and we're left with tools like GoFundMe to try and paddle ourselves upstream. And so I write, a consequence of the late neoliberal project is that our economic, social, and technological realities have become so entrenched that imagining change feels impossible. As Angela Davis observed, dangerous limits have been placed on the very possibility of imagining alternatives. These ideological limits have to be contested. We have to begin to think in different ways. Our future is at stake. So one of the architects of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, so frequently used the phrase, "there is no alternative," to describe her economic and social policies that she was named Tina. As Paul Farmer describes, the mental hegemony of neoliberalism limits our ability to recognize the value of more collective and just health systems. The commonweal, Farmer writes, the sense of shared opportunities and misfortunes that bind us together. After all, what is pooled risk, if not sharing, is often one of the first casualties of hardcore neoliberalism. So what is the alternative becomes a question that invites hopelessness rather than imagination. Dreaming up alternatives can be an act of resistance and a pragmatic strategy for beginning to remake and reimagine our current systems. At first glance, we might think of crowdfunding as a convenient time-saving alternative to dealing with the complexities and costs of the US healthcare system. It fills a gap conveniently. But this book tries to show that rather than being an alternative to the moral and financial toxicities of our current health system, crowdfunding reinforces both its functions and its values. Rather than being an alternative, it distracts us from alternatives, diverts our attention and energy away from fighting for them. So in this final section of the book, I offer some thoughts on meaningful alternatives and adaptations of crowdfunding that might otherwise be hard to imagine. This is by no means a comprehensive account of alternatives, but rather an invitation to engage in a more collective project of imagining and creating other ways to connect, to care for each other, to cultivate repair in a time of crisis. I offer these alternatives with the recognition that we must all figure out, as Lauren Berlant puts it, how best to live on, considering. We are all living, as it were, in the meanwhile, in the aftermath and rubble of accumulated and persistent crisis, and before the kinds of change we would hope to see have come to pass. But living in the meanwhile is not about surrender or accommodation, but engaging in the smaller acts of repair, change, care, and community building that can add up to something bigger. As Ruha Benjamin explains in her amazing book, Viral Justice, all the great transformations that societies undergo rely on the low-key scheming of everyday people. So let's get scheming.
Yeah, I was wanting to steal that whole entire phrase for myself, but I do, before we open it up to audience questions, I did want to ask you, so much of this book is you talking to various people, writing down their stories, trying to tell them ethically. Not all of these stories are tragedies. Some are, end in success. Some end in ambiguity. But is there any particular story or person you talk to that it still sticks to your mind's ribcage?
Yeah, I think the story that probably weighs most heavily on me that I carry is the story of Trevor, who was a single dad in Arkansas, who was really struggling. He had type 1 diabetes. He was recovering from a terrible accident. He talked about struggling to figure out if he could pay for insulin or keep his house from foreclosure. And in a series of text messages that he sent me late night one night, he talked to me about how he knew how to create a campaign that would tell this story and that would make him seem deserving. But when he went on GoFundMe and he started looking around, he saw all of these campaigns for people that were just even more tragic than him. And he kind of said to me, like, who the fuck am I to put my shit up there? And so he wrote the campaign, he built it because he really needed help, and then he never told anyone about it. And so he just put it up there, and he said, it's like I'm dropping a line into the water. I'm hoping someone will come along and find it. And that, to me, really captures some of the shame and the complexity of what people are going through when they're trying to figure out whether to do this. And I think it humanizes, for a lot of us, what that struggle is like and what is not visible to us when we're just kind of trolling through these sites or getting sent them on Facebook from time to time.
Yeah, I believe it was his story where you kind of coined the term crisis ordinariness,
Yeah.
I want to say. And while you were obviously talking about medical expenses and healthcare, I couldn't help but think, as somebody who does a lot of reporting on working class people, how that is everything from childcare to rent to food, insecurity. Mm-hmm. And so you bring up in the book, when in the chapter on solutions, you bring up and highlight mutual aid and mutual aid in the city of Seattle specifically, and how some of those things are still in operation. And so I want to ask you, how do the successes and the continuation of some of those mutual aid initiatives continue to, how should it inform how we live in the meanwhile, and how we build the world that we want to actually live in?
Yeah, I mean, I think mutual aid has this really beautiful, long-standing history in communities of activism and marginalized communities, of figuring out a way to meet people where they're at, and how to meet their immediate needs, and also how to plot for this larger change towards the future, right? How to do the community organizing and the education and the solidarity building that gets us slowly, so slowly, but so slowly towards these better steps in the future. And Amy Hagopian and I and grad student Emily Hops got to spend some time with mutual aid organizers during the pandemic, and a lot of these organizers went into it feeling like, okay, we're doing this for a couple months, we're gonna figure out how to get some masks and some tests to people, and and they're still doing it. And there's a stickiness to that work, and that work is incredibly difficult and messy. It's so messy and it's so hard. But I think we can draw some inspiration from those types of doing that work that is long-term, and it's engaged, and it's thinking about the hard ethical questions, and it's building community, and it's not just donating $5 and sorry for racism, and it's really thinking about how do we build the critical consciousness that we need, as well as recognize that you have needs and I have needs right now, and those also need to be addressed.
Well, I want to open it up to audience questions right now. I think my former boss, Kelly Powers from the League of Women Voters, had a question. I see her in the back. Yeah. If you want to come up, Kelly.
Your conversation got me really fired up, and there's just so much work ahead of us, right?
Yeah.
A few years ago, I started noticing the GoFundMe as you encounter it in your life. And I thought, as a good activist, I want to figure out for every congressperson what the GoFundMe rates are
Yes.
for their legislative district. Mm-hmm. And now I realize I also need to ask what GoFundMe accounts aren't raising money and how much they're not raising. That's what you've taught me tonight.
Oh.
Those are two questions we need to answer. But how do I get that data? Because I did approach UW, who was doing some studies, and they said, oh no, we can't share that information with you. The GoFundMe would not like us to share that information. It's proprietary and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a whole other side to the GoFundMe and the crowdfunding story, and I would say more broadly the sort of tech industry does health infrastructure story, which is that the more we do that, the more the data and the information is held privately and is really hard to access. So I and other researchers have accessed some of that data at personal risk, and a lot of us really struggle to continue to access that data, to know what's missing there. For example, I don't know if Mark is here. Mark? Okay, Mark Agra, who is a brilliant, very technical scholar who worked with me on some of these larger studies. He figured out that a lot of other studies hadn't even found a lot of these campaigns that were raising $0 because they were so difficult to find on the sites and on the infrastructure. So I think there's a couple questions here. GoFundMe is sitting on so much data that they probably would be one of the best places to identify cancer clusters in the United States right? And no one knows how they're using that data or where they're selling it or how they're profiting from it. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could use this data, and partly it requires making companies like GoFundMe feel like they actually owe the public access to that data. And I do think there's some important work being done by researchers who study large-scale digital platforms to try and get more public access to that data. But it's very much an uphill battle, and until we win that, we really don't have the kinds of information that we need in order to do exactly that kind of public political effort. Thank you.
Thank you for this book and for your work. And I warned you I would ask this question, but
I'm ready for it.
for some reason, Facebook knows me really well. Does anybody else have that happen to them? So I was recently invited to join this Facebook group called Dystopian Late-Stage Capitalism Horrors Repackaged as Heartwarming Stories. So that's a page you can join on Facebook. And they present you with a plethora of these stories that sort of remind me of the things in the book. But we've probably all noticed now GoFundMe pages for helping people escape Gaza. And talk about a dystopian late-stage capitalism horror story. It's Gaza, right? And what are we to make of this? I mean, Gaza is a creature of American foreign policy, and 36,000 people have now been murdered by American policy there. And we're going to have a GoFundMe page to help people escape this. It's just bizarre. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, thank you for asking about this. Those campaigns have been on my mind a lot, especially over the last couple of months, as it has become one of the primary ways that people feel like they can help people who are stuck. These campaigns are trying to raise thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to afford border crossings, largely into Egypt, and oftentimes for very medically fragile people or people who are in desperate need of medical care. So I think there's something of the crisis in Gaza and Palestine that is, I think, impacting all of us, which is the proximity at which we're being asked to witness horror and be asked to bear witness to it over and over again with very few things that we can do to stop it. And I think, in particular, the horror of feeling that we might have something we could do with a GoFundMe campaign, and also, really? And knowing, as we do, that there's probably far more campaigns out there than we can possibly donate to, or possibly even weed through in order to figure out where our donation might go furthest, right? Like, I don't think as humans we're meant to make these decisions individually on our own, staring at our phones late at night. Like, I think we're supposed to figure these things out in community and in political community together, right? And I think to the extent that we're forced to pay attention to these things individually, we really lose focus on the larger places where our energies should be. And also, like, those are really important ways of getting people help right now, right? So it's both. There's a phrase that I quote in the book from a scholar named Michael Duffield, and he talks about the enforced resilience of abandonment in places of crisis and humanitarianism, where, like, yeah, we're holding on to each other and we're figuring out ways to, pull people out of the rubble or whatever, and also, like, this is forced on us, and we need a better way out of doing this work. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about what is the business model of GoFundMe?
Yes.
How do they make their money? What implications are there for whether we want to participate in that platform?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So GoFundMe is a for-profit company. They do have a nonprofit arm called GoFundMe.org, but it's very small. And they are privately traded, which means that we don't get very much financial information about how much money they have or where their money comes from. What we do know is that a lot of their money comes from tips and fees that are accompany donations to the platform. So used to be that you actually just kind of got charged a certain percentage when you donated, and that came out of your donation, and now they ask you if you want to donate a tip. However, some of you have probably experienced this on the platform, the tip is like automatically set at like 15 or 18%, and it's like particularly hard to opt out. So I was actually laughing because a colleague came up to me a couple weeks ago and was like, I'm so excited about your book. Also, I give a huge donation to someone on GoFundMe and I accidentally tipped, and like that was a lot of money. And so I think that it's safe to say that a lot of their money is coming from tips. They have a very lean business model, right? Because it doesn't take a lot to host these campaigns. Mostly they rely on community members to do the work of content moderation and policing and like identifying fraud that other companies are paying droves and droves of human beings to do. And then there's the whole question of what else they are selling, right? So as I said, they're sitting on reams of very personal data. It is not uncommon to come across people posting exceedingly private things about themselves on crowdfunding campaigns. So we don't know what's happening with that data or how it's being marketed. I will say, so there's a couple options. If you're just like, I want to opt out or I want to like not give them, so you can opt out of the tip. You can also always, I know this is old fashioned, but you can actually send people checks. Or you can PayPal them. One of the other suggestions that I make is like, if you have the financial wherewithal, as you make a donation to a close friend, maybe also think about making a donation to a community organization in a matching amount that supports more kind of upstream solutions. And so just, I think there's plenty of ways to help our friends and family, which like, I'm not telling you not to give to your mom if she's, starting a GoFundMe, don't do that. But I do think there's other ways that we can engage and temper that engagement a little bit.
I have a little bit of a two-part question. It's a past and a future.
Okay.
The past part is, I was wondering if you have some insight on like the whole GoFundMe phenomenon, which is fairly recent, like you said, 10 years, or fits into kind of the history of charitable giving.
Yeah.
Arguments about, well, if we do welfare, people won't work. If we do food banks, people won't go find their own, So that's kind of part one. And then the second part is kind of go the other way. And having not read the book yet, sitting on my shelf, I wonder if you have ideas for how we can fix this mess we're in.
Big questions. Thank you.
Little thing.
Yeah. So the question of how we got here, I think, is really important. And we see these long, long histories of especially philanthropic and charitable donors really wanting to be able to choose who their money goes to. So we see that in things like, I don't know if anyone's participated in like a World Vision Save the Children type campaign. You get these little cards with like kids on them. I also tell the story in the book of this bizarre phenomenon in sort of late 1800s London of these charitable societies doing orphan elections where rich sort of London society would get together and different segments of these charitable organizations would campaign on behalf of different orphans that they thought should get spots at an orphanage. And then they would have these elections where people kind of bought tickets to vote for which orphans could go to the orphanage. So this is but like, I think there's a way in which that evokes so much of what's actually happening on GoFundMe, right? Like we're not that far away. And also we have this veneer of like social media that's happening on top of that, right? That's amplifying all of this and deepening it. So I think it's important for us to think about crowdfunding platforms as a tool rather than a solution. We've come to think of them as a solution. Like, you have cancer, you don't have health insurance, GoFundMe. And we're not thinking about it as like, okay, this is a tool. We can choose how we want to use it. We can use it to organize community. We can use it to inform people. We can use it to build movements, or we can use a different tool as well. And so I think we have to redevelop a sense of agency about sort of the kinds of ways that we want to organize community. I've spent a lot of the last couple months talking to disability advocates and chronic illness organizers about the kinds of digital tools that they actually use in this sort of organizing work. And a lot of times they're like, well, Google Docs, you know? It doesn't have to be fancy in order to be good enough to do this work. And so I think there's a place and a time for a GoFundMe, and it serves a purpose for a lot of people, and it does a lot of things for a lot of people in terms of connecting them to care and support and community. And also, we can choose how we want to use it, and we can choose to use other things as well.
Well, I do want to close with this question, and I didn't prep you for it, so
Okay,
like,
great.
You know. But it seems to me, with just reading through the book and just observing life, you have this rise in these crowdfunding platforms, and ultimately they're individuals, right, acting collectively, whether or not they want to believe that they are, to address a problem. But I don't understand why people are so readily willing to do that, and yet not necessarily take collective action. Like, I remember in 1992 when President Clinton tried to reform healthcare, and that landed with a thud. Even President Obama, obviously in 2008, with the ACA, which was very inadequate, but still, like, the things that were said around that time, where you had people not wanting a whiff, quote unquote, of socialism within their medical care system. So it seems to me, as somebody who's a storyteller, that the story of what we sort of have internalized here in America about about individuality and not really wanting to take care of each other, and you're okay, I'm okay, we're okay, right? So I want to ask you, what is a new narrative that we need to press forward, right? What is the new narrative we need in this country to be what we can become as this country, meaning like a country that is the society of care and compassion, as opposed to more of sort of the Hunger Games style that we're seeing in our healthcare system?
I think I would have answered this question differently before COVID, and probably a lot more optimistically. And then during COVID, we just watched a lot of people really not care about other people in their community suffering and dying. And I think for me and a lot of folks in public health, that was a really harrowing moment where we realized, like, we have a problem with, like, we have an empathy problem, we have a caring about other people problem, and until we deal with that problem, we're not able to do the core work of public health, or get people to do public health work. And I see that persisting and getting worse as we kind of are making our way through the aftermath of COVID. So I think the first thing is a notion of shared fate. Ironically, I think actually GoFundMe is weirdly good at this in maybe ways that the company doesn't intend, because we bear witness in a lot of these campaigns to the horrors of the healthcare marketplace. And a lot of people are definitely expressing, as they look at campaigns, like, I am as vulnerable as you are. It could happen to any of us. A lot of people told me, I'm giving to this guy's campaign because it could be me next month. So I think it's, first of all, a sense of shared fate, but then also a desire to share in the shared resources, right? And we have this really dirty history in the United States that is, I think, very much fueled by racism, of a lot of people voting against their own interests when it comes to charity, when it comes to social support systems, when it comes to Obamacare and other things, based on the idea that they do not want to share in a network with people of a different race or class than them. So Jonathan Metzl has written about this in his book, Dying of Whiteness. This comes up with things like, gun control as well. And so I think the next piece that we actually really need to do, and this is really hard, is to build a sense of deservingness that is based in sort of universal rights and humanity, rather than this selective deservingness based on characteristics or personal history or what state you live in or anything else. And what we do know is that plenty of other countries have accomplished this. I spent last summer in Norway, and my colleagues in Norway were completely unable to wrap their heads around GoFundMe. And it was just not making sense to them. And you walk around Oslo, and there's all these advertisements for the the public medical insurance program that really appeal to this sense of sort of shared fate, and also the idea that everyone has this this right to be in the pool. If you look at the kind of core motivations behind GoFundMe are actually a motivation to be able to select and choose who you support. That's exactly the same notion that undergirds a lot of opposition to more universal health systems. So if you look at the kinds of right-wing alternatives to healthcare, they're often about, I choose my network of risk, and I limit it to people who are like me. GoFundMe is exactly the same for most of us, whether or not we realize that. And so I think we gotta start moving away from that, and we also gotta start making that familiar thing strange to us, so that we can begin to reckon with a more collective sense of what we owe each other.
Well, the book is Crowded Out. Nora Kenworthy, thank you so very much.
You're the best, thank you.